Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our event. I am not your felon, engaging the lived experiences of formerly incarcerated Black women. We sincerely welcome you here at the College of New Jersey, and we look forward to engaging with you throughout tonight's event. I am Professor Michael Mitchell. I'm currently a visiting assistant professor in the departments of African American Studies and Criminology here at the College of New Jersey. And I am so proud and honored to have our invited panelists. Just to inform you, tonight's event will be recorded, and the recording will be made available very soon, hopefully within the next 24 hours. I would sincerely like to thank the Division of Inclusive Excellence for their logistical support, as well as the Departments of African American Studies and Criminology, as well as Students for Prison Education and Reform, also known as SPEAR, which organization I'm currently the faculty advisor for here at TCNJ. I thank you all for co-sponsoring this event. As we begin, we will start with some brief remarks from Dr. Jane Wong, who is currently the Dean for the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the College of New Jersey, followed by Dr. Piper Kendricks Williams, who is the Department Chair of African American Studies at the College of New Jersey, and last but not least, Dr. Margaret Leger, who is the Department Chair of Criminology. So, Dr. Wong, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Professor Mitchell. It is indeed my honor to welcome all the attendees to this forum on I Am Not Your Felon, and specifically showcasing the voices of Black women who have been incarcerated in our criminal justice system. As the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, I am extremely proud of both the African American Studies Department and the Criminology Department. But what I am exceptionally proud of is Professor Mitchell, who holds appointments in both departments and therefore represents both the social sciences wing and the humanities wing of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I oversee 11 departments and 15 majors. What unites those departments and majors would be that whether we're talking about Spanish language and literature, sociology, African American studies, criminology, or psychology, each of those disciplines play a role in telling the human story. The human story, whether it is our history, our future, our present, it is what unites each of those disciplines. Professor Mitchell, by virtue of his joint appointment, I think epitomizes the best of both the social sciences and the humanities, as I alluded to, but also how the human story can be told in different ways. As a criminologist, he will no doubt be able to tell our students and our public the statistics, the disproportionate incarceration of Black Americans. But nonetheless, that white Americans also have large numbers of incarcerated individuals. So the study of statistics is in Professor Mitchell's purview, and his students no doubt will learn about those statistics from him. But more germane to tonight's presentation would be the telling of the human story from voices that perhaps have been suppressed for far too long in our history. The voices of incarcerated Black women, not Black women who have achieved to the heights of academe as perhaps Piper Williams has, or I as an Asian American have been able to do, but the voices of incarcerated Black women. And our students will hear from Professor Mitchell, not just the statistics, but the lived experiences of these women who have been incarcerated. And our story is not complete unless we have both ends, the statistics and the very personal stories. So it is for that reason that I was so excited to have the opportunity to hire Professor Mitchell twice, first as a visiting assistant professor, and for those of you who may not know, as a tenure track permanent, we hope, assistant professor at the College of New Jersey, because he epitomizes what I want the School of Humanities and Social Sciences to do, to show us the pure numbers, the statistics, because that is important for our students to learn, but also voices that have not been heard in our history. So I welcome Professor Mitchell to the TCNJ community. I welcome all of our participants. Thank you for being a part of this event. And I thank all our attendees. And I hope many of the students from each of our 4 institutions. And I hope that this is just the beginning of the journey for our students. Thank you, Professor Mitchell, and thank you to our guest panelists for this important event.
Thank you, Dean Wong. And next we will have Dr. Piper Kendricks Williams, again, the Department Chair of African American Studies here at TCNJ.
Thank you, Michael, for the invitation to offer a welcome to this exciting and important event. The African American Studies Department provides a rigorous academic and intellectual experience that centers on the Black diaspora. Our department also understands that the personal is political, and we strive to offer guidance, mentorship, and support that go beyond traditional academic advising. That is why I'm looking forward to this lecture and the discussion that will follow. I know from Michael that both Dr. Jason Williams and Dr. Sean Wilson are his mentors, and of course, each serve as a model for him as graduates of an HBCU and as Black men in the academy. In addition, Jason, Sean, and Zoe focus on qualitative research and scholarship, which reveal the complexity of narratives and voices of the most marginalized. And it's obvious, and their research approach is obviously a model for Michael. As any of you attended the presentation on February 12th at the African American Studies teaching on, we heard the voices of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Black fathers. And I know just from my students' responses to that it blew them away. You know, we think of someone as like a felon, a criminal. We use all this language that dehumanizes them. And so to hear these men voice their, sorrow for the lost time that they don't have with their children, their fear, their regrets, it was very, very moving. So I affirm what Jane said about, the human story. It's lost a lot. And I know in the field of criminology that relies so much on numbers that people get lost behind those. As our department recognizes its first 50 years at TCNJ and plans for how to celebrate this when we all can get back together, we consider those who came before us and how we can continue the legacy, knowing that the past is often present. The past includes the people whose shoulders we stand on: writers, thinkers, academics, performers, entrepreneurs, intellectuals, and activists who have survived and thrived throughout the hundreds of years since the first Africans arrived in the New World. For African American Studies here at TCNJ, there are 3 people who are essential to the history of our department. Dr. Gloria Harper Dickinson was the biggest booster for us. She was the longtime chair of African American Studies. She hired me, I won't tell you how long ago, and essential to our legacy. Don Evans, playwright and artist, was chair for many years. And Stephen Chukwumba, born in Nigeria, was the founder of what was then called Trenton State College, African American Studies Department. Our present finally includes a major in African American Studies. After about 44 years as a department, we got a major in 2016. This was the dream of all those in our past who were committed to the significance of Black people's experiences in our nation, in our world. The present also encompassed the faculty hired recently. Just this year, we hired Michael Mitchell as a visiting professor, joining our departments along with criminology. and next fall he will start in a tenure track position. Our future definitely looks bright. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, and I look forward to you presenting, and thank you for being a part of our Black History Month programming.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And last but not least, we have Dr. Maggie Leger, who is the Department Chair of Criminology here at TCNJ.
Thank you. Good evening. I'd like to thank Professor Mitchell for organizing tonight's event and the panelists and authors of the article, Drs. Williams, Spencer, and Wilson, for sharing their time and expertise with us and all of you in attendance tonight. Among the themes explored by the authors was trauma, and in particular, carceral trauma. I wanted to connect their findings and bring attention to the ongoing investigation into the abuse of women incarcerated at Edna Mayhem, the state women's prison in New Jersey. Some of you may be already aware of the investigation. It's important to note that Black and African-American women comprise of 46% of the women who are currently serving time there. In January, 30 prison staff members were suspended pending a criminal investigation into the abuse at the institution. Edna Mayhem had previously been investigated by the Federal Department of Justice and found to have a culture of abuse, and that the report noted that the prison, quote, exposes women to a substantial risk of serious harm from sexual abuse, end quote. Based on interviews with women who were formerly or currently incarcerated, the rampant sexual abuse committed by prison staff was characterized as, quote, an open secret, end quote. The DOJ report published in April 2020 detailed how staff coerced women into sexual acts, groped them, and exposed their breasts and genitals during searches, and routinely verbally demeaned them with slurs. Quoting from the report, the incidents of sexual abuse follow similar patterns where officers and staff sexually assault and harass women who are vulnerable to sexual abuse and fear retaliation, violence, deprivation of privileges, or endure sexual abuse in exchange for food, medication, or contraband in violation of the prisoner's constitutional rights, end quote. Physical abuse has also been reported, with women suffering severe and potentially permanent injury. One woman sustained a broken eye socket in an assault. A transgender woman suffered injuries so severe that she can no longer walk and is in a wheelchair. Earlier this week, a bipartisan group of lawmakers brought articles of impeachment against Corrections Commissioner Hicks for failure to stop the physical and sexual abuse by prison staff. One of the Assemblywomen who brought forth the articles, Assemblywoman Muniz, stated, Governor Murphy and Commissioner Hicks have been given ample opportunities to make the necessary reforms to protect the women at the prison. My colleagues and I will not tolerate one more transgression. The legislator is proceeding with the impeachment of Commissioner Hicks because we refuse to allow the women's cries for help to fall on deaf ears any longer. We must remove the man at the top who has shunned his responsibilities for far too long. The violence that the women have experienced by prison staff could have important ramifications for their resilience, mothering, and reentry, other themes the authors explore in their article. This leads me to close with a reiteration of one of the major findings from the authors. Through our critical analysis, we learned that our participants were under the control of a system, formal and informal, that wantonly pursued a prejudicial and dangerous program against their livelihood. These frameworks do not accept the hypothesis that the criminal legal system operates in a value-neutral manner. Moreover, the default of neutrality would be inconsistent with both history and African Americans' lived reality in general. Therefore, the analysis of marginalized groups must account for their genuine experience and matriculation through social institutions, especially those charged with administering social control. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion tonight.
Thank you to all of my colleagues who gave such warming opening remarks. As someone who is new to TCNJ, and plans to spend the rest of his career at TCNJ, it brings me great joy to know that I work with awesome colleagues, as well as students and administration that supports the work that I do, my particular lens, and what I can bring to the TCNJ campus community. So, I sincerely thank you from the bottom of my heart for those warm, welcoming remarks. So as a special note, Dean Wong, Dr. Williams, as well as Dr. Leger aren't leaving us completely, but they'll be simply rejoining the event as attendees to allow for more screen space for our guests. Later in this discussion, we will move to Q&A. So feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A feature. While of course we cannot get to each question, we will try our hardest to condense and answer as many as we can, so we apologize in advance. Now, in continuing with giving thanks, I'd like to thank all of you, the audience, for taking time out of your personal lives and busy schedules to be with us tonight as we engage in discussion surrounding a grave social and racial justice issue: Black women in the carceral state. Tonight, we share space with three veterans who have devoted their personal and professional lives, despite the risk of reprisal, imprisonment, and death, to serve. Their service is not within the United States Armed Forces. Rather, they put their bodies on the line to fight for the marginalized, oppressed, vulnerable, and helpless among us. Each has survived their own experiences of combat, whether it be that of navigating the unforgiving terrain of the American ghetto, resisting school pushout and the risk of juvenile incarceration, or protecting and raising Black children in a society that places greater value on the lives of agents of the state and racist vigilantes than the right to childhood for youth of color. Therefore, their service matters too, and for it, they deserve to be honored, respected, and commended. The three panelists here tonight will discuss with the TCNJ community and beyond findings from their recently published research article titled, "I Am Not Your Felon: Decoding the Trauma, Resilience, and Recovering Mothering of Formerly Incarcerated Black Women," published by Sage in the Journal of Crime and Delinquency. As a scholarly contribution foregrounded in the lived experiences of Black women transitioning from incarceration back into the community, the authors will share with us how interlocking oppressions of race and gender and even class affected participants' matriculation through several carceral terrains, including prison, motherhood, and Blackness. In introducing our guests, first, we have Zoe, or Dr. and Auntie Z, as she is affectionately referred. She's an Emmy Award-winning writer and scholar activist, and a beloved Virginia State University, an HBCU, professor from Berry Farms Projects in Southeast DC. Despite her struggles, she received her PhD, MSW, and BA from the Mecca, Howard University, and her Master's of Legal Studies from the Washington University St. Louis School of Law. As a staunch freedom fighter, she has unapologetically dedicated her life to addressing all forms of oppression and disparity, no matter the construct. In such, she has not confined her work to the halls of academia and professional spaces. Instead, she has advocated for victims of state-sponsored violence, organized direct actions, one of which was featured in Ava DuVernay's documentary 13th, and committed to serving as a regular speaker, presenter, and educator in men's level 2, 3, and 4 correctional facilities in Virginia. She is a highly sought after presenter and lecturer with hundreds of professional presentations to her credit. Her critical and creative work is dedicated to addressing neo-lynching and state-sponsored violence in America, and includes her Emmy Award-winning spoken word piece, Say Her Name, which pays homage to the victims of historic and contemporary lynching in America, and her scholarly publications, which include Sassy Mouth's Unfettered Spirits in the Neo-Lynching of Corn Gaines, and Sandra Bland, Conceptualizing Post-Traumatic Slave Master Syndrome in the Familiar Policing of Black Women's Resistance in 21st Century America, published in the renowned feminist journal Meridians. And Why Welcome Back Jim Crow, Neo-Lynching, and the Criminalization of the Right to Resist in 21st Century America, published in the Criminal Justice Journal and Law Review, Special Edition. But most importantly, to her divine purpose, she is Ma to her son, Grandma to her future freedom fighter, Isla Sebin Kemet, Auntie to her beautiful, brilliant HBCU students who are on the front lines of this resistance movement, and an unapologetically Black Z to any power structure that is oppressive to the people. To the struggle, she is a comrade and an ally to the queens and sisters from races, identities, and spaces who stay on the front lines in the battles against all forms of oppression and brutality. Next, we have Dr. Jason Williams, who is a passionate activist criminologist, deeply concerned about racial and gender disparity and mistreatment within the criminal legal system. He is a New Jersey native, raised by his grandmother in a housing project, which ultimately led him to pursue a doctorate in the administration of justice from Texas Southern University. Aside from publishing in the academic arena, his perspectives are also posted on several public outlets, including the Hampton Institution, Truthout, and NewJersey.com, among others. He's been quoted by many local and national presses on issues concerning criminal and social justice. He has conducted ethnographic research in Baltimore, Maryland, and Ferguson, Missouri, following the police-involved tragedies of Freddie Gray and Michael Brown. He is also beginning police and community-based research in Newark, New Jersey, following the installment of a federal consent decree that proved pervasive unconstitutional policing practices. He has also published extensively on returning citizens and their navigation through reentry. Lastly, he recently published a co-edited book, Black Males in the Criminal Justice System. Last but not least, Dr. Sean Wilson is an assistant professor in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department at William Patterson University here in New Jersey. As a community-based scholar, Dr. Wilson's research seeks to foreground the voices and lived experiences of the oppressed and marginalized. Dr. Wilson's research interests include reentry, critical policing, critical criminology, critical gang studies, and race, class, gender, and justice. Dr. Wilson sits on the boards of several community organizations that are committed to social justice. Most notably, he has served on the Newark Community Advisory Committee at the New Jersey Institute of Social Justice, helping to serve the community by ushering change through community organizing and progressive changes in policy. He also serves on the New Jersey Supreme Court's Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for the Passaic vicinage. In this capacity, he works with professionals within the judiciary and other helping professions to educate primarily marginalized residents about offerings within the court system. So, for tonight's event, there will be a series of questions specific to the article of tonight's discussion, the article that each of our three panelists co-authored and published together. These questions will focus on the author's three themes of trauma, mothering, and resilience. So for our opening question, the question is two-pronged. So it's essentially two questions. So your recently published article focuses on the experiences and perceptions of Black women navigating reentry. I'm curious, what was the motivation for writing this piece? And why now in this moment?
Yeah, I guess I'll start. The motivation. Black women have, like it's been mentioned earlier, Black women have always been on the front line fighting for justice, fighting for equality, fighting for the marginalized. And I think about, my life being raised by a single mother and how she was always resilient, how she fought against structural inequality in society to provide for me and my sister. And I think about Dr. Helen Taylor Green, who's in the chat. She was one of my former professors, mentor. And she was always strong, and she always motivated and inspired me to use my research, to use my platform to fight for justice, to fight for people who don't have a voice in society. Otherwise, getting all these degrees will be a wasted opportunity. We'll be sitting in these offices doing nothing, not contributing to our community, not making a change, not changing lives, not changing how people experience the criminal legal system. And so that's always been my motivation when it comes to my research. But in particular for Black women, especially ghettoized Black women who are oftentimes criminalized and told that their perspectives or experiences don't matter. It was a duty for us to do this article, to use their voices and narratives to shed light on how violent the criminal legal system is for Black women.
And yeah, like you mentioned, Sean, some of these women, they are our aunties, they are our sisters, right? They walk amongst us. And while we were conducting a lot of these interviews, many of them cried with us, right? And demanded that we get these stories out there. Now we know, with IRB, there are certain ethical practices, but some will tell you, no, you use my name, right? They want to be on the record. But the time was now, right? The time is always right, frankly, to unearth injustice, right? And the inhumanity of this system. But frankly, there is this sort of silence and effect in the broader literature around the lived experiences of Black women as they navigate the system. I see that Janet is in the chat, she does a lot of work around this and others as well, but there isn't enough out there. Michael, of course, yourself, you've done work around this. And then, of course, I can't, leave out the fact that Sean and I have been waiting to do something with Dr. Spencer. And so, yes. And so to team up with Dr. Spencer and to do such a powerful article, with somebody as powerful as herself, again, with her powerful research and theoretical background, the time was now. And again, as Maggie mentioned earlier, knowing the frequency of the sexual abuse around the country in these prisons, the time was now to get this on the record. And by the record, we mean into the body of knowledge.
If I can piggyback really quickly, I think that Maggie, her heavy introduction speaks to the necessity of the work. If you look at the climate that we're in, this climate where anti-racism, disrupting racism and disrupting patriarchy is so important. The article is timely, but even more significantly, when she was speaking, and I'm just going to talk to everybody, but when she was speaking, just feeling the correlation of what is happening there. And I'm in Virginia, so I didn't know about this until today, but just feeling the correlation of what is happening right now to that historical trauma that women, Black women in particular, but women in general have experienced. It is the exact same parallel phenomena. And I think that I'm blessed to have been brought on to join Jason and Sean in this work because I think it's time to write pieces, qualitative pieces that disrupt races and patriarchal narratives of Black women's lived experience, especially incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Black women's lived experience. And the last thing for me is I am that Black woman from the ghetto. Outside of all of those degrees, I am that Black woman from the ghetto. And so I think that it was important for me to use the privilege and blessing that I've been given to amplify the voices, not give voice, but amplify the voices. And as Jason said, to make public the voices of the people that so many people disregard and discard and ignore.
Powerful, and I mean this, and as we'll get into, the rest of our discussion tonight, this piece was, this piece rocked me to my core. It was heartfelt, you know. I think that's often was something that's what's missing in not only criminology research, but social science research. Empathy, you know, the ability to feel, you know, the true human suffering that we often talk about in our work. You know, qualitative researchers like ourselves who have, you know, who have engaged in this type of research, you know, looking at reentry and how individuals coming out of prison, coming out of jail, you know, navigate society with that criminal label, but also how it extends and it impacts their families and their communities. You know, but this particular article focusing on formerly incarcerated Black women in general. You know, I'm the son of a Black woman, and although my mother is not formally incarcerated, to my knowledge, has never been incarcerated or impacted by the system. She's still a Black woman that has had to navigate a racist and sexist society. So reading through the narratives in your article, you know, it was deeply felt because I can only imagine the children out, you know, the children living in this country, in the United States, who have had to endure this. These are their life stories. And I'm glad that this article, you know, amplified those voices, those marginalized voices. So question number one relates to your theme of trauma. So in the article, you discuss 3 types of trauma that participants experience: pre-incarceration, carceral, and post-incarceration trauma. Consistent with the literature on gender and reentry, childhood and familial trauma are common pathways to incarceration for women. So regarding pre-incarceration trauma, so that trauma before the period of incarceration, how are the experiences uniquely different for formerly incarcerated Black women in your study? And this is for any of the panelists.
Did you want me to go? I'm gonna just jump in and then y'all tag team in. So the literature is really ripe, especially when you're dealing with nonviolent offenders. And so the literature is right with this correlation between substance abuse and incarceration, and then the link between childhood, family trauma, substance abuse, and incarceration. And in the narratives, we found that all of the women expressed traumatic childhood and family dynamics before their incarceration. Many of them expressed issues with substance abuse before incarceration. And so their narratives were really consistent with the statistics of that relationship. However, the racial dynamic was important for us because the question that we really raised and discussed, like, it was just deep, like we were just in it, in the narratives and trying to understand that there is a difference in both perception and reaction to Black women, right? Black girls and Black women. And so now as we see, for example, with the opium crisis that largely impacts middle-class white people, that there's a different reaction to Black women's trauma. There's a different reaction to Black girls' trauma. And so you have to look at a Black girl experiencing family trauma. What that looks like, a lot of them didn't dig into it, so I'm not going to speculate on it, but what are the recourses that are available for young Black girls who are experiencing childhood trauma, which could include sexual trauma, could include, and some of the participants expressed that their family members were addicted to substances and they have been incarcerated too. What are the resources available for young Black girls in urban or lower working class communities that would be able to address those? And then how does the lack of resources, the lack of access to appropriate resources for those girls then lend to coping mechanisms, maladaptive versus adaptive coping mechanisms? And so substance abuse and trauma are directly linked. And substance abuse, according to the literature, is a maladaptive coping mechanism. And then how that then lends to incarceration. And so you can't, when we were talking about it, we didn't want to just say, okay, well, there's this relationship and it's, this is how Black women experience it. But we really wanted to tease out how the disparities that we talk about every day, the structural barriers that we talk about every day, impact Black girls and women, Black girls and teens, and then how the lack of access to those resources contribute to that carceral state.
And just adding to that, from an analytical or theoretical standpoint too, there's sort of social political placement within our society. So in the piece, we sort of look at how Black women have always been this sort of historical carceral subject when you consider their intersecting oppressions, right, that they experience. And we underscore historical materialism, critical race theory as a means to tell that story. The story sort of talking about how the commodification, if you will, of their very existence, from slavery all the way up through the present day. And through this story, we kind of underscore the worst practices of racial capitalism, because again, we're underscoring that commodification process. And we also connect this to practices of social control by way of the mothering processes, right? And by way of the criminal legal system, obviously, because we're talking about, right, corrections, the carceral state. So when you consider, again, their social political positionality within this broader context, past and present, we also then begin to understand why it's important to privilege their standpoint epistemologies as well, and to look at this very distinct suffering, which again unearths the mistreatment that they experience while navigating these systems, as well as the procedures and these policies themselves.
We also pointed out how formerly incarcerated Black women deal with trauma, how it impacts their daily lives, how it impacts how they matriculate or move through the criminal legal system. And so we coined a term called conscious traumatic repression, which argues that for the most part, in our study, our participants were aware of the trauma and in the role that it plays in impacting them being able to provide for their family, be able to avoid engaging in substance abuse, and they're able to not really think about the trauma, although it is there, right? And so they were very open about the trauma that they experienced in their lives, but they still had to remain resilient. They really couldn't really think about that, although they should, right? They need mental health resources to be able to navigate these traumas that they've experienced. But unfortunately, reentry services in New Jersey don't really provide these necessary resources for mental health. And reentry programming isn't really concerned with Black women's lived experiences, their realities, and how their race and gender, right, shape their experience, and also class shape their experience with the criminal legal system.
Which, and I'll add, which we must understand is a discursive added penalty, right, as a result of their inclusion into the system. Right. And so, look, you've come into the system, you've done your time. Now you're back out into society. And this is an added penalty as a result of being a Black woman. Right. And this added punishment also exists in the broader culture. Right. And in their families and in their larger communities.
And I wanted to jump into, because the concept of repressive resilience, which we also coined in the article, really deals with the fact that Black women's resilience oftentimes encompasses repressing the emotion that is associated with the unresolved trauma. And because of the lack of access that Black women have to adequate mental health and health services, most literature speaks about resilience as being an adaptive force and repression as being a maladaptive force, if you look at it theoretically. However, we wanted to illuminate how Black women's resilience is absolutely dependent on them being able to repress the emotions that are associated with the trauma, both in the pre-carceral state, in the carceral state, and then the post-incarceration state. And we found that theme and the way they manifested that, like, it was so deep, the way that they manifested it and the way that they spoke about their traumatic experiences, and the way that they spoke about, for example, the loss of their children. And we talk about recovering mothering, but the loss of their children and how regaining their children from the system or from family members was so important to them, and how the loss of their children impacted them. You can see how those levels of repression become essential to Black women who don't have access to adequate mental health care. So.
And I couldn't help but notice similar thoughts of suicide from formerly incarcerated Black women in your study, and those in my own research, and social network, those that I'm personally connected to that are formerly incarcerated. There was a particular narrative from a participant named Tara, who discusses the daily post-incarceration trauma she deals with. And I quote, "I definitely understand why the young man who spent 3 years in Rikers committed suicide," referring to Khalif Browder, "because even though he was free, I bet you at some point he didn't feel it. He felt like that heavy load never lightened, because it's a heavy load that you carry." So my question is, how is the carceral state complicit in the self-destruction, hopelessness, and helplessness that returning citizens, especially Black women, experience?
Can I jump first? Go ahead. No, I saw you take it off, Jason. You want to go?
No, it's okay.
I just want to lay a historical foundation because we used historical materialism as one of our theoretical foundations. And really, historical materialism deals with that history of the exploitation of Black women's productive and their reproductive labor, the commodification and objectification and sexualization of their bodies. And so I'm gonna lay that real quick, Jason, and then because I just wanted to lay that foundation that this phenomena that Black women experience in carceral spaces is historic for Black women. So when people talk about slavery is over and we should get over it, these experiences, if you even think about, I still have trauma from Maggie's introduction, but when you think about what women are going through now, you're talking about raping, snatching babies from wombs, beating, groping. All of those things are well grounded within the history of Black foremothers. And so when you're looking at the experiences, the lived experiences, and we have to understand that cultural transmission shifts that. There's never really been a break. You go from enslavement, exploitation of Black women's productive and reproductive labor. You go to Jim Crow, exploitation of Black women's productive and reproductive labor. You go through Jim Crow Black codes, convict leasing systems that separate Black mothers from their children. You go to the welfare state, and then you come into this new space. And so that history of exploitation and commodification and objectification and sexualization of Black women's bodies is very well grounded in our history. So what the women are experiencing and what they expressed in this study is really reflective of that history. So I just wanted to lay that. Jason, tag you in.
Absolutely. And it's important to note too how it is directly connected to the state, right? So it is state induced. And as a result of this influence of the state, it actually messes up the family dynamic. Right. And so as they're trying to, and we didn't get into recovery mothering yet, but as they're trying to regain access back into their families and primarily connection with their children, they're facing this sort of sense of abandonment. And so all of these sort of mental health issues that they face is, again, in direct connection to these influences of the state. So it is an added penalty. And I'm going to keep sort of saying how these are gendered added penalties, right, that they face as a result of having come in contact with the system, even after they allegedly, paid their debt. And we have to problematize that a little bit too, but even after they've served their time, and paid their debt to society.
And it also induces a sense of hopelessness, of not knowing what you can do to fight this system. And it's important for us to think about the impact that, this has on children, of not knowing if mommy is coming or going because of racist criminal justice policies, because of restrictions when it comes to parole or probation. And so many of our participants, stress that it was nothing they felt they could do to really fight against this unfair system. And so I think it's important for us as critical criminologists, as public criminologists, to foreground our research in the lived experiences of formerly incarcerated mothers, because there aren't a lot of people in society who view their concerns or view their experiences as something that we should care about. And so in this time of Black Lives Matter, say her name, I think it's important for researchers to not just simply see Black people as statistics, because oftentimes, you'll see us as numbers, right? Black people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, right? You'll see a whole bunch of research that's telling us stuff that we already know. Like you could talk to any Black person who's come in contact with the criminal justice system, and they'll tell you, right, that it's a fair and racist system. And so it's important for us to, if we're thinking about transforming the criminal justice system, we have to base our reforms or our changes in the system in the narratives of people who come in direct contact with this system, who have their families destroyed, who have their communities destroyed, who feel that they can no longer make it in this society. And it was definitely a traumatic experience for us as researchers, having to, experience their traumas, and for them to share with us the realities was, I would say, extremely humbling. And I'm grateful that they, trusted us enough to open up, for us to hopefully, hopefully there can come some change. And we shared this article with a lot of policymakers and criminal justice practitioners in the state, and we received a lot of great feedback. So, hopefully this can result in more people doing more meaningful, community-based, qualitative, critical research that seeks to foreground the oppressed and marginalized.
And if I can just add how, and I know, Zoe, you mentioned this sort of the cultural transmission, right, of all of these traumas, and how these mental health abnormalities will cycle down to those kids. Because as Sean said, they're sitting at home, don't know whether mommy is coming or going, right? And let's remember, if not for the state, this wouldn't be the case. So we have to understand how this punishment is ensuing, and it is race and gendered. Race and gender. And we got to liken this to the past. I mean, how is it qualitatively different from when Massa would take the babies from the Black women on the plantation? How is it different?
For Jay, and let me tag team in, for a profit, for a productive gain. So the profit, they're snatching children in order to sell them off in order to make a profit. So if you go back to enslavement, the convict leasing system, to mass incarceration today, all of that matters. I'm sorry, I had to tag team in.
No, you're absolutely correct. And we mentioned it in the article a little bit, and how this creates a higher likelihood for these kids to what? Morph into the juvenile justice system, right? Because now that they're dealing with all of these mental health abnormality, they can become victims of the street. We know that there's a high correlation between access or being brought into the juvenile justice system and then graduating into the adult criminal justice system. So the cascading effects are real and highly criminalizing to the Black community. And I often say that this is intentional, right? So I don't give white supremacist systems the benefit of the doubt, right? Because these systems, when we look at them, they don't tend to be new, right? They don't tend to be new.
And let me add to that, Jason, because it absolutely is. The school to prison pipeline is a real phenomena, and the criminalization of Black people's trauma is a real phenomena. So when you look at, for example, the scenario that Jason just gave, then you have the children who are experiencing trauma at home, and then they go to school, and then the system, right? We're talking about state-sponsored violence. The system places SRO, school resource officers, who are only regular police officers who are placed in the school system to criminalize the behaviors of children and adolescents and to facilitate, and this is real, to facilitate the transition from the school into the criminal justice system. So, and just on a personal note, like, if this system was in place when I was growing up and I got in my fights in my school, I would have been locked up too. And so we have to look at the way that state-sponsored violence through the promotion of the incarceration of Black women and Black children is a real phenomenon. In Virginia, we rank first in the school to prison pipeline in the nation. So it is a real phenomenon. That is
directly connected to the over-incarceration of Black mothers, right?
And so in recent decades, since we talked about motherhood, women have become the fastest growing segment of the United States prison population, many of whom are mothers. 8 of the 9 participants in your study are mothers. You found that the carceral trauma these women experience impacted the family unit as well. Several participants shared stories of not one, but several of their children battling mental health crises, for example, suicide attempts, nervous breakdowns, etc., as well as experiencing health complications like asthma, like severe asthma attacks that occurred during the mother's absence due to incarceration. So my question is, how did incarceration and reentry challenges affect the maternal identities and self-image of women in your study?
May I go first, brothers, again? So race and gender play a big role here. And given the historical context of Black mothering, it's not a traditional mothering. So during the institution, the article points out that during the institution of enslavement, reducing Black women or stripping Black women away from their maternal selves was core, because Black women and their children were considered property of the slave owner. And so from that point, Black women have not had control over their sexual, productive, or their reproductive labor, or they haven't had agency over their subjective role as mothers. And so after emancipation, the research speaks about how Black women in particular struggle to regain that mothering instinct, because they go from enslavement to domestic workers. We're still in that space. They're not mothering their own children. And so when you look at the traditional gender role establishes the sense of femininity or womaninity or womanhood or womanness in the role for a woman traditionally and patriarchally for a woman as a wife and a mother. And so the stripping and women in general in society are identified by how well they carry out those traditional gender roles. And so Black women have traditionally been separated from that subjective role. What we found in the research that was so phenomenal, like, was the trauma that the Black women experienced at losing their children. It wasn't even always the incarceration itself, but it was the way that the incarceration separated them from their children. And in the narratives they spoke about, I think just about all of them spoke about how when they were asked, what did they think about while they were incarcerated, most of them spoke about their children. And then in coming out, it was about reuniting with their children, because reuniting with their children is kind of like the restoral of that identity. And even with the mother who was older and her children, were kind of off, it was about reuniting with her grandchildren. And so we coined the term recovering mothering, because we understood that for these Black women, mothering as a source of identity was important. And when it was stripped from them in the carceral space, it was a source of trauma. And so in that post-incarceration state, their drive was to recover that mothering by reuniting with their children.
But also sometimes due to cultural scripts, right? It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always easy. And so we cite to lots of, Black feminist literature, Collins and the alike, to help contextualize some of those parts of the narratives.
Mm-hmm. And so we found that with a lot of our participants, there was always an internal trauma, right, of fearing that they won't be able to recover their motherhood. And there were some participants who their relationships with their kids were destroyed. They haven't been in communication with their children. And like Jason mentioned, this is all because of the state hyper surveilling their communities.
Another form of state-sponsored violence. And I agree with Jason. I think in all of our activist roles, we recognize that, there's a reason for that. And the reason is well-grounded in history, that, you can make the argument, theoretical argument is well laid, that it is an intentional dynamic, societal dynamic.
Yeah, the continuation of the breaking of Black families. This was a strategy during slavery, and it has continued. And when we look at what happened in this particular study, right, we see the criminal justice system as a tool of the breaking of Black families. And so again, this particular article is just looking at Black mothers, right? But we've done other studies, and actually, the four of us who are working on another study right now that are looking at fathers. So yes, but the criminal justice system as a tool to break Black families. And it, again, as you mentioned, so fully grounded in historical precedent.
Well, and I'm thinking about even some of my own personal research with formerly incarcerated mothers, and how some of them felt that they lost legitimacy and respect, and in the eyes of their children, and therefore had to earn the status of mother again. And then I recall some talking about how they felt their children, even in some cases, took advantage of this, but felt that they deserved it. The mothers themselves felt that they deserved this due to their involvement in crime and incarceration. And it's just sad and unfortunate when you look at the carceral state and its impact. And I think we have to look at the carceral state and stop individualizing it. Well, they did the crime, so they have to do the time, and whatever happens afterwards is on them. The research tells us, and it even, your current article, it discusses in detail why it's so hard for formerly incarcerated women, especially Black women, to land on their feet, to avoid reincarceration. There's so many, institutional policies and barriers in place that prevents that.
And Zoe eloquently broke it down, but and really quickly, It's because the children and even the other family, the extended family, are still unfortunately holding them to those same norms of like what motherhood and femininity is, and not fully understanding how the state has completely stripped that away, right? Completely stripped it away. And so that's most, unfortunate for them. And so this is what creates those additional mental health abnormalities, as well as the stripping away of trust from the kids. And so I think we really have to contend with whether or not this is intentional. I mean, I believe it is, right? There's historical precedent for this, but we have to begin to look at that for the fierce form of state violence that it is. It just don't come no worse than that. To break families apart like that, children from their mothers, no worse than that, and then when you think about, the path that these mothers really, really try to embark on with getting back with these kids, imagine that, right? To only be told by your child, who are you? Who are you? Who are you?
And the pressure, though, the stigma of the labeling and the stigma that is associated with, and that's why we named it I Am Not Your Felon. Like, the stigma that society places on the incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated. And then, especially when you're dealing with young children, the way that those labels and the way that that stigma and society's lack of empathy, and this is what I want to impart, like, to everybody who's on the call. It's important for us to, one, understand the structural barriers that impact incarceration, period. Like, you can say, oh, well, they did the crime, but there are structural forces that impact crime and deviance, period. And then the way that the stigma, the social stigma, conveys to the children, the lack of societal forgiveness, and the way that that conveys to the children in their willingness to understand, their willingness to reconnect, their willingness to trust, and then also understanding, we talk about substance abuse as a disease, but crack wasn't a disease for Black mothers. Crack was a crime for Black mothers. However, we have to also look at the stigma behind substance abuse and the way that substance abuse also impacts the family. And so all of these factors matter, and in one way or another, be it directly or indirectly, the women spoke about those experiences as being really critical factors. And then the last thing I want to say is, no, Black women have a really rough time, as do most incarcerated or formerly incarcerated people, because the system, and that has to be a part of criminal justice reform, the system isn't designed to help people get back on their feet. The system is designed to ostracize and alienate them from the economic, social, and political resources that they need to be able to recover, which we know the literature supports. There's a direct correlation between that and recidivism. So, if you want to keep the beds full, then you make sure that the formerly incarcerated don't get on their feet.
And really briefly, how that stigma translates down to the kids, right? So, oh, your mommy in jail, right? Your mommy did this, and and so kids can be cruel. Right. And so that's also a factor that contributes to the, the abandonment of these mothers by their children.
And so last question before we head into Q&A. So Black women in your study also experience resilience, but not in the traditional sense. They engaged in what you coined conscious traumatic repression as a survival mechanism. So for instance, I quote with, the particular instance where in your discussion, when Tara asked what the psych at the halfway house was going to do after she spilled out all of her emotions and trauma. Crystal, when you asked her to elaborate about her father further, and she mentioned that she'll keep, I'll keep that door closed. How did engaging in repressive resilience impact your participants? And what do you think is the root of the practice of this form of resilience?
I remember us talking about that, right, y'all? And we were just like, whoa, how do we unpack it? How do we unpack it? I'll just say really briefly and let y'all delve into it. We in our discussions around this, we definitely contextualize it in a lot of the Black feminist literature around the cultural scripts, right? We won't talk about what happened years ago. Instead, I'm gonna hold that in and repress it. But go ahead, Sean or Zoe.
Let me jump in, Sean, because Sean talked about it earlier, but let me jump in on Jason's point. When we were talking about it, we talked about the history of repression as a cultural phenomena in the African American community, and the narratives that what goes on in the house stays in the house, and that you don't tell your business. And so we thought about that, and that's the way we contextualized it. Conscious traumatic repression, that they consciously repress the trauma in order to be able to cope and in order to be able to live. And Michael, when you were talking about the woman's relation to Kalief Browder, that how does she survive, right? And that's what we talked about. How do they survive? How do they survive the burden, that heavy burden of their lived experience, and still keep going? And over and over and over again, we saw how they would consciously repress their trauma. And so when people were trying to prod and get them to speak about what happened, there was a conscious effort to keep that bottled up. And when we talked about it, we talked about how that was resilience. It was the antithesis of what people would think, because people, in a traditional sense, would argue that resilience is dealing with your stuff and then healing. But in the absence of the opportunity to heal in a constructive and adaptive and a therapeutic way, these women absolutely chose to repress the trauma, consciously repress the trauma as a form of coping, which was integral to their resilience. And I don't know about anybody else, but when we were fleshing that out, and then Sean, when we were fleshing that out, we really viewed that as being powerful on the alternative. And that was something that we want, that people don't cope the way everybody thinks they should, but just because they don't cope the way the book says that they should cope doesn't mean that, one, they're not coping, and it doesn't mean that they're not resilient.
Yeah, we really had to contextualize that within the greater cultural reality, what has kept Black women going for so long, but also understanding too, we got to understand the trauma that's being, right, that's being sort of digested here, right? That the trauma that they are taking on, nonetheless, right, at the surface level, if you will.
And it's definitely important for us to examine this extra trauma added on to their pre-incarcerated trauma that they experience, but also the trauma that they experience while locked up. And we mentioned earlier, right, how violent prisons are. And so these are things that they navigate through daily that are totally different than white women, right? Other women don't have these experiences. They don't have these historical realities, right? We can backtrack to slavery and we can look how Black women repressed their trauma during slavery to protect themselves and their families. And so this has continued to the contemporary when we look at mass incarceration, when we look at the policing of Black bodies.
And let's not forget the transmission, right, of family secrets. So, I may have been sexually assaulted, but so might have my mom, my aunt. So I'm carrying around their secrets, and all of this, right? All of this is playing a role in my own experiences of trauma. So I carry all kinds of vicarious traumas around with me.
Wow.
And navigating all of this, right, without adequate mental health resources in their communities. Human rights issue, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. And the audience is very engaged. I'm going to move to Q&A so that you can answer some of their questions. So we have here Thank you for this work and this panel. I love this article. My question is, how did you all deal with the vicarious trauma of doing this research? I am sure that it was hard to hear these stories, and I think it is important to acknowledge the toll it takes on you as people.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you all noticed earlier, but my voice kind of cracked because I got emotional just with, the amazing introductions and just thinking about the trauma that these women continue to experience, because right, these issues are continuing, and they will continue, unfortunately. And to know that this isn't just something in New Jersey, but all throughout the country. And yeah, I mean, but it's amazing just to have this, I call us the dream team. So it's always amazing just to have amazing colleagues that you work with. If you're feeling down, you can discuss these things, and to have that common lived experience was extremely helpful and important. And yeah, just reflecting on how this has impacted my family and other people's families that I know. It can be traumatic. So, but just the passion, I guess, that I have for shedding light on these issues helps me to navigate the pain, right, that comes from listening to these narratives.
And being able to call each other, whether we in our text group, right, or calling each other just to laugh about other things and get away from, the study for a little bit also helps. But I agree, of course, with everything that Sean mentioned. I can imagine for Zoe, however, though, very different.
Yeah, I am a trauma survivor, as I'm sure, we all are in our own way. And so for me, being in that space was actually cathartic, because I felt like I was in a position to give voice to the experiences of my sisters, because they are my sisters. Like, they're my sisters, and they are, they are me. I've never been incarcerated, but easily had the conditions been reversed, who's to say. So for me, just reading and feeling and absorbing that, I think for all of us, though, like, it gives you the passion that you need to be able to say, forget academia. This is about doing the work and the purpose of doing the work. And what I love about our dream team is that it was purposeful work, and no one was doing it, to get a publication. It was doing the work for the sake of giving voice to the sisters, and then putting it out there, and now doing this so that everybody else can hear their voices through us. And so for me, that is a part of my own resilience. That's a part of my own catharsis. And then too, I just love my brothers. So it was just dope anyway.
We love you too.
Yeah, love you too. So, hi, were you one of the first to publish work like this? I would imagine not, but if you were, why do you think that this wouldn't be researched as much?
I don't think we probably to look at it through, maybe not even the first to look at it through these frameworks, perhaps. But like we mentioned earlier, just not enough qualitative research out there on the lived reality of Black women cycling through the systems, and maybe not, and certainly not through these particular frameworks either. Yeah, I'm gonna take that back, and when you look at some of the coinage that we've inserted into this paper as well, that's rather original. So, we were happy to work on it. And shout out to Crime and Delinquency too, the editorial team, because very thankful to them. I mean, they were very intentional in reaching out to scholars of color in particular, and trying to get these types of perspectives into that journal. So very thankful for that as well.
So I'm sorry, Sean. Go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I think I interrupted. Go ahead.
Oh, no, feel free.
Okay. Well, I think it was, I don't know if it was the first, but I mean, I think we have to acknowledge, my area is more sociology, but I think we have to acknowledge the supremacist and patriarchal space that our work is built from, and it exists in. And so I think it was important to disrupt the traditional narratives that research on the correlation between race, class, and crime has. I mean, we're in the process of undoing, right? And I think it's really important to undo, because we have to undo the long history and the long libraries
That's
of
right.
racist and patriarchal studies that place Black criminality in this Lombrosian framework, this biological framework, or this functional framework. And I think what makes the work unique is that we do disrupt that narrative. And that's the only way that you can properly give voice to the lived experiences, is to begin to challenge the traditional theoretical narratives that people's experiences are placed in. And that's one of the things we talked about qualitative research. That's one of the important things about qualitative research. You can pitch numbers all you want to. And I think that as Dr. Wilson talks about decolonizing, academia, you can pitch, numbers and statistics all day long, but statistics don't tell a story. And I think when we ground everything in this qualitative scientific body of knowledge, we miss the fundamental things that influence those numbers. So before you get to quantitative, there is a qualitative epistemology, etiology, if that makes sense. And so I think the work is original and necessary in that sense.
Oh yeah, and creative. I often tell, Michael knows this because I've been telling him all the way through graduate school, be creative. I see myself as an academician and a researcher, almost akin to any artist, whether they're a painter or a singer, right, rap, whatever have you, as the creator of sorts, and with this piece, we were able to be very creative. We went outside the boundaries of traditional scholarship for sure. Okay. Even whether it's methodologically, looking at our analytical frameworks, we went outside. And so I think it's okay for us to be creative. And I would certainly encourage others to be creative. When you're writing up your articles, write in the creative writing context, Bhattacharya, a qualitative queen, often say that, social scientists should take classes in creative writing so that you can connect with people. We have given this article to people who, aren't even college educated, and they're able to digest it because of how it has been written.
And before you go, Sean, I've already gone, but I think it's important, for institutions to also respect that thinking out of the box. And that's a part of the work that needs to be done. You have to be able to respect those who do not write from a quantitative space, who may be more creative and critical thinkers, who may be more theoreticians. And so, I'm encouraging TCNJ, as you go through your process, Dr. Mitchell, to make sure that they, respect that qualitative space when they're evaluating you for tenure and promotion, and everyone else for that matter.
Definitely.
Yes, I was just going to add that in the discipline of criminology and criminal justice, it's had a long history of excluding contributions of Black scholars. And Dr. Helen Taylor Greene's research, speaks to this reality, how we're not included on journal editorial boards, how we're not really included in professional organizations or divisions. And so that's a way to exclude contributions from Black scholars. So a lot of our disciplines, right, have a lot of work to do. They need to be decolonized. They need to be torn down and built up to reflect the diversity in the discipline, because there are a lot of us who are doing great work. Like we mentioned, Janet Garcia Hallett and others who have been doing phenomenal work. And so I think now is the time for criminology, criminal justice, sociology to begin to support and embrace critical work from scholars of color.
Yeah, and Janet is another person that, like I mentioned earlier, who does similar work to this subject. So.
Sorry. So I am struck by the fact that you all have connections to HBCUs. I am curious about how this informs your research and your activism.
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, so Sean and I haven't gone to TSU, and I'm certainly also for you, Zell, but and Dr. Green is in the chat, right? She created the program. We always say we went to a race and crime, or as I like to say, I like to correct it, race and justice program. Because in every course we spoke about justice, race, excuse me. So, and Michael's coming out of the same program. So I think that pretty much, lit a few in us as far as, the necessity of being activists. And everything we read was about the importance of, heightening the voices of the marginalized. So, and of course, when we went into TSU, we were already activists. So, but yes, I think my HBCU education definitely plays a role. Definitely. I mean, I studied under Dr. Green, Dr. Bay, and several other scholars whose work is and was phenomenal in that area. So I couldn't help but come out and be racially conscious about things. I couldn't help it. Don't blame me, blame them.
Yeah, my experience at Texas Southern was, I would say, a life-changing and empowering experience. Our professors motivated us, they inspired us, and they allowed us to be our authentic selves. And so that really prepared us for the academy, right? Because criminology is a white-dominated discipline. And so Texas Southern, empowered us to enter the discipline knowing that we belonged, right? We belong and we have something to contribute. And so that's just been something that's really always stuck with me and inspired me throughout my journey as a college professor, as an educator, is to reach students of color and to let them know that you can be your authentic self. You belong in these spaces, and your perspectives matter. And that's what we learned, outside of learn about the administration of justice, like Jason mentioned, race and justice. We learned, about people who sacrificed for us to have many of the opportunities that we have now, the work that they put in for us to be able to be here today, right? To have this panel was because of people like Dr. Green, Dr. Vernetta Young, and others, right, who went through hell, right, navigating criminology. And so for us to be here is a testament to everything that they've done throughout their careers and lives.
Yeah. Go ahead, Zoe.
No, just really quickly, for me, as Sean mentioned, Dr. Vernetta Young, I went to Howard 3 times, and I chose to stay at Howard 3 times. So Dr. Vernetta Young was my professor in undergrad, and then she was my professor when I went back for my PhD. And also, I'm way older than my brothers, and so I gave birth to my son while I was a student at Howard University in undergrad, and this was in the 80s, right at the onset of the crack epidemic in Washington, D.C. And so for me, being a Black woman, single mother in the 80s, giving birth to a son in the 80s in the height of the crack epidemic, and then this new war on drugs, this newfound war on drugs, forced me to begin to really dig into my maternal space as a protector of my son. And in order to protect my son, I realized that I had to understand the system, and Howard University definitely gave me the space, because like Jason and Sean, when you're at an HBCU, everything is about justice. It doesn't matter whether you're studying sociology, criminology, or dentistry. It is about giving back to the community and being trained to give back to the community. And so I think that's the way my HBCU experience that I would not trade for the entire world prepped me for my activism.
Thank you all so much. So we're running out of time. We have about 5 more minutes. I was going to answer that question, but I'm going to ask one last question. If we don't get to your question, feel free to reach out to us individually. You can reach us on our school websites. I'll be more than happy to provide an answer to your question. So you coined the term repressive resilience. Shouldn't this be a reason for firms to hire formerly incarcerated Black women, namely because they possess repressive resilience, despite the challenges of pre-incarceration and carceral trauma?
I have one word, yes, period.
Yeah, and preferably in community settings, right? And community settings, dealing in community-based programs.
I agree.
And their wisdom, the wisdom and the knowledge that they impart through their narratives and through their understanding is really, really amazing. Like, people write people off who are incarcerated. I also do work with incarcerated men in the different levels of the prisons. And I can honestly say that they are some of the most brilliant people, and creative. And so I think we lose track when we're talking about felons and formerly incarcerated and them, that we forget that they are the we. They're in that space, but they are still the we, meaning they are all of us, and they have their own subjective values, and their subjective values are very diverse and heterogeneous. And so I think society misses out when they label and write people off simply because they've been labeled, and that society would probably benefit greatly from being more open to hiring people who have that repressive resilience and who have managed to be like survivors in spite of.
Get rid of that. Get rid of the politics of disposability. The people you are disposing are perhaps probably more intelligent than you are.
So I hate to end our conversation. I know we can go on for hours and hours, but I believe I speak accurately on behalf of the College of New Jersey when I say it was an honor to have our panelists engage with us this evening. As a campus community that is making strides toward being an anti-racist and inclusive institution, it is conversations with speakers like these that help us achieve such goals. For current and prospective students, if you have interest in engaging further in discussions of race, inequality, oppression, social justice, among others, we have majors and minors that center these topics at the College of New Jersey. For further information, you can contact myself, Dr. Leger, or Dr. Piper Kendrick Williams. To all of our guests, I express my sincerest gratitude. I mean, from the bottom of my heart, I love all of you. Each of you have been instrumental in my own, journey. So thank you, thank you, thank you. To all of our guests, I express my sincerest gratitude for your attendance and questions. And again, you can reach out to us individually if you have, questions about tonight's event. And there will certainly be more discussions. Hopefully we can have our panelists back in the near future. So everyone have a wonderful evening and be safe.
All right, thank you, everyone. Take care.